freedom at the Hudson Institute, and want to welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming. We're very enthusiastic about our guest speaker today, Reverend Dr. Mark Durie, who is here all the way from Australia, and he is kicking off our series on lifting the theocratic Iron Curtain, focusing on the application of Muslim blasphemy and apostasy rules in the contemporary world. And all of us here at the center, my colleagues Paul Marshall and Beth Curley and I, are quite excited about this program because we believe that religious freedom is at the very heart of human rights, and it is very apparent in the situation of apostasy and blasphemy, where there is state coerced religion, that other human rights are put in jeopardy as well, whether it is freedom of expression or women's rights and other freedoms of association. So there is in front of you, I believe, a list of our series. This is our first. We will be examining how this is threatening, how these rules are threatening religious freedom, both in the West, in Australia, as we're going to discuss today, in the United States, as we will be discussing later with the new book out on the cartoons that shook the world, and also in the Muslim world. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to my colleague Paul Marshall, who will introduce our speaker.
Okay, thank you very much, and may I also welcome you. Just before introducing Dr. Durie, making a few comments about him, I will pass around copies of, this is a flyer for a forthcoming book of his, The Third Choice, Islam, Dimitude, and Freedom. So please take a copy of the flyer, and when the book appears, when will it appear?
I expect it in February next year.
And remember to buy a copy in February next year.
It'll be on Amazon, etc.
Okay. Dr. Durie obtained a PhD in linguistics from the Australian National University with a study of the province of Aceh in Indonesia, northern Sumatra, and is an expert on Achenese. As an aside, I might mention, several of you will probably know this already, but yesterday the legislature in Aceh unanimously passed a new bill saying that in Aceh various requirements of Islamic Sharia law must be met. One of the provisions was stoning to death of people convicted of adultery. So this was simply yesterday. Aceh is not the theme of Dr. Durie's comments in his session, but he is an expert on that area. So if you want to raise questions about that as well, please feel welcome to do so. He's been a visiting researcher at the University of Leiden, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, UCLA, and Stanford. He headed the Department of Linguistics and Language Studies at the University of Melbourne, was an Australian Research Council Senior Research Fellow. He was elected a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities in 1991 and awarded an Australian Centennial Medal in 2001 for contributions to linguistics. This was already a distinguished career, but at this point he's sort of changing career, and Mark now works as the Vicar of St. Mary's Anglican Church in Melbourne. He is also a human rights activist, writes and speaks extensively in Australia and around the world. He was just in Nashville on issues relating to freedom of religion and the persecution of religious minorities, particularly Christians living under Sharia law. Mark, thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Paul and Nina, for having me here. I really feel honoured to be here today and very grateful for the opportunity to speak. I'll be offering some reflections on freedom of speech issues from an Australian perspective and focusing on the issue of public critique or criticism of Islam. It's hardly controversial to say that passing critical comment on Islam can attract the strongest imaginable opposition. I think the sensitivity of Muslims, or at least many Muslims, to critical portrayals of their faith was first drawn to the public's attention in recent times in the case of Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses novel, published in 1988. However, the special sensitivity of Muslims to critique was already noted by Beaumarchais in 1778 in the freedom of speech monologue in The Marriage of Figaro. Figaro comments that if he were to write a play about the Seraglio, passing comments on Muhammad, he would in no time be receiving envoys from far-off places, warning him that he had offended the Ottoman Empire, Persia, much of India, all of Egypt, as well as Ethiopia, Tripoli, Tunisia, Algeria and Morocco. Clearly, speech about Islam is a sensitive issue for Muslims, and for Muslim states indeed. All around the world today, Muslim leaders are emphasising that there must be limits to freedom of speech. It is important to acknowledge, I think, that Islamic objections to critique of Muhammad and Islam are profoundly theological. It is the theological motivations for these objections that accounts for their remarkable persistence across time and space. Islamic Sharia textbooks include detailed proscriptions which determine the various kinds of ways in which it's not permitted to blaspheme against Islam, Allah or Muhammad. In traditional Islamic jurisprudence, such transgressions were, if performed by Muslims, regarded as evidence of apostasy, a capital offence. If the transgression was performed by non-Muslims living under Islamic rule, the dhimmis, that is the subject of that book the flyer has been distributed for, then this was regarded as annulling their covenant of protection and could earn the same penalty. Ultimately, the reasons for Islamic strictness about religious criticism go back to the story of Muhammad, I believe, and his own responses to criticism and mockery from fellow Arabs and from the Jews of Medina. Negative commentary was interpreted from the earliest times as fitna, that is, seduction or persecution of Muslims, which could lead them away from their faith. To criticise Islam then was to attack Muslims personally. As the life story of Muhammad is the theological bedrock of Islam, this became a theological principle in Islam, and it is these theological principles which account for the very personal way in which many Muslims receive criticism of their faith all around the world today. Just note that I believe that the tradition of anti-blasphemy laws in Europe is quite different. I believe that in England blasphemy was illegal for a different kind of reason. The reason was that if people were blaspheming, that God could be offended and might judge the nation. So it was an issue of keeping the community safe to prevent actions that could incur the wrath of God. But I think in the Islamic tradition, the offence of blasphemy is primarily its capacity to undermine the faith of Muslims, to lead them away from the faith, and as an example of fitna. And then those key verses in the Quran that say that fitna is worse than slaughter, which is repeated twice, and fight them until there's no more fitna, begin to kick in if you have that interpretation of criticism of Islam. I'm not going to delve into these theological roots any further, except to note that a coherent response to this phenomenon has to take its theological characteristics into account. I really would prefer now to turn to the vexed question of how Western states, and particularly the legislatures, should respond to pressures from Muslims to provide a means of legal redress when they consider that their religion, their prophet or their God has been maligned. It's most important to note that this international pressure for legal processes is only likely to increase. It will not go away. The slogan of Islamophobia has been established to give a focus to the international campaign. In 2005, the organisation of the Islamic Conference adopted a 10-year action plan to address challenges facing Muslims in the world today. Item 6 of their plan was to combat Islamophobia, and one of their strategies was to get the United Nations to, I quote, adopt an international resolution on Islamophobia and call on all states to enact laws to counter it, including deterrent punishments. End quote. At the December 2006 meeting of the OIC, a decision was taken to create an observatory to monitor all reports of Islamophobia. This strategy has proved effective. In August 2007, the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia and Related Intolerance presented a report to the UN Human Rights Council on the manifestations of defamation of religions, and in particular on the serious implications of Islamophobia on the enjoyment of all rights. After this, the OIC's anti-defamation of religion resolutions were passed, first by the UN Human Rights Council and then at the General Assembly in December 2007. The ultimate purpose of these initiatives is to enforce limitations on critical speech about Islam as a part of international law. But let me turn to Australia and the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act of the State of Victoria. This law was enacted in 2001. It was modelled on anti-racism legislation from the 1970s. The model was extended in 2001 to apply to religion, and the purpose of the 2001 Act was to promote the harmony of an increasingly diverse society. I quote now from the Act, the introduction to the Act. The people of Victoria come from diverse ethnic and indigenous backgrounds and observe many different religious beliefs and practices. The majority of Victorians embrace the benefits provided by this cultural diversity and are proud that people of these diverse ethnic, indigenous and religious backgrounds live together harmoniously in Victoria. Now, the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act of Victoria, the state in which I live, is an example of what's been called religious vilification or anti-vilification legislation. And here already a word of clarification is required. In everyday understandings in the English language, the word vilify means to viciously defame another person. It implies untruthfulness and malice, as any number of dictionaries will show. This concept fits into what is known in English common law tradition as defamation, or what the Ninth Commandment calls bearing false witness. To prove defamation, one must show not only that someone's reputation was harmed, but also that the damaging conduct was untruthful. Now, although the Victorian Act makes free use of the term vilify throughout its headings and in its preamble, and also this was raised in the debates in Parliament, in fact it's not about defamation at all, but about something subtly yet crucially different. The law was constructed around the concept of incitement, taken over from anti-racism legislation. Let me read from the 2001 Act. A person must not, on the ground of the religious belief or activity of another person or class of persons, engage in conduct that incites hatred against, serious contempt for, or revulsion or severe ridicule of that other person or class of persons. In essence, anti-incitement laws seek to discourage the development and strengthening of negative stereotypes. This is important in combating racism. And the critical issue is not whether a stereotype is truth-based, but whether it causes a negative impact on a group's capacity to contribute and function well and even just normally within the society. Many ostensibly true statements could be used to incite negative stereotypes. For example, the French eat snails, or Koreans eat dogs. In fact, quite truthful reports can incite very strong emotions. For example, an accurate representation of the facts of the Holocaust could be expected to incite contempt and revulsion against Nazis. It would not be defamation, but it would be incitement. Now, partly because of this consideration, anti-incitement laws typically have exceptions built into them which allow incitement for certain purposes, such as academic or artistic communications, political commentary, or a public debate done reasonably and in good faith. For example, a discussion of the systemic patterns of disadvantage suffered by Australian Aboriginal communities, which include high rates of alcoholism and child sexual abuse, would be acceptable in an academic discussion or in a commentary in a newspaper, but if the same factual information was used in a mocking or contemptuous way, it could be an example of incitement. When Victoria introduced its Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, little thought, however, was given to the implications of shifting the concept of incitement over from managing race relations into the domain of religion. Indeed, the Act covers both categories of religion and race virtually identically, the only distinction being that under religion there was an exemption for religious purposes, that is, conduct done reasonably and in good faith for a genuine religious purpose was exempt. Just to note, the way the law acts is that the complainant has to prove the incitement, and then the respondent has to prove the exception if they wish to claim the exception. So the exception is assumed not to apply until you can prove that it has applied. Now let me describe how this issue of incitement and some of the complications that it brought played out in the case of the Islamic Council of Victoria versus Catch the Fire. This was a case born out of the aftermath of 9/11. In the months following the Twin Towers atrocity, a Christian revivalist group known as Catch the Fire invited Daniel Scott, a Pakistani travelling Christian pastor who specialised in teaching on Islam, to run a seminar in Melbourne. Daniel Scott had apparently been the first person accused under the blasphemy laws in Pakistan, and he fled Pakistan at the time to come to Australia. So there was something of an irony in the fact that he was being brought to court again in Melbourne. Now, the subject of the seminar included a morning session on jihad in the Quran and also some afternoon training on how to witness to Muslims. Unknown to the organisers, the Islamic Council of Victoria got wind of the event and sent along 3 converts to attend it. They took notes of what they heard, were very disturbed and distressed by it, and a complaint was lodged through the Victorian Equal Opportunity Commission based on the 2001 law. After attempts at conciliation got nowhere, the complaint was taken to the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal. Now, already before the case came before the judge, important lines had been drawn in the sand. The Christians asserted that they were criticising Islam and not attacking Muslims, and insisted on their right to make this distinction. The Muslims, for their part, insisted that it was impossible to make this distinction, and that to criticise Islam was something that they had every right to take personally. This distinction was continued by their lawyers. Brind Wojnarski, a QC for the Islamic Council of Victoria, said, "If one vilifies Islam, one is by necessary consequence vilifying people who hold that religious belief." Another key feature of the complaint was that many, if not all of the points of complaint involved statements which had at least some kind of factual basis. For example, one of the points of complaint was that, and I quote, "Pastor Scott intimated that Muslims are killed by other Muslims if they leave the Islamic faith." Now, strictly speaking, this has some basis in truth. It does happen, and Islamic law does impose this penalty according to the various schools of Sharia. And it's also true, I believe, that such a statement could have the tendency to incite bad feelings towards Islamic law. Another point of complaint was that Scott had reported that Christians are persecuted and killed in Muslim countries. This statement was also said to incite contempt, hatred and revulsion against Muslims. Many of the points of the complaint were about statements about the Quran. For example, one of the points of complaint was that Scott had declared, "Allah teaches that taking part in jihad in the heat of the desert is preferable to the heat of hell." And that's literally what the Quran says in Surah 9:81. Now, the Muslims did not only object to the statements, they also objected to the manner in which they were made. Scott was said to have used a mocking tone and elicited laughter from his audience. This is quite important in the question of whether the activity was done in good faith and reasonably. Now, as part of their defence, the Christians sought to appeal to the exemption for religious purposes. They maintained that they were engaging in conduct for a legitimate religious purpose, reasonably and in good faith, and so they provided copious documentary evidence from the Quran that went on the public record and also from other Islamic authorities, If their statements were valid or had some basis in truth and could be substantiated, they reasoned that this showed that they'd acted reasonably. On the other hand, the barristers for the Islamic Council argued that it was irrelevant whether or not their statements were true. Incitement was not about truth, they said, but about the power of conduct to stereotype others. Even if the statements were true, the barristers argued, the complaint should be upheld. Bryn Wojnarski for the Islamic Council said, "The mere fact that a statement may be true or an objectively justifiable expression of opinion does not prevent the statement from being seen as inciting hatred, contempt, ridicule or revulsion." And Debbie Mortimer, also for the Islamic Council, stated, "Truth is not a defence, it's irrelevant to contravention of the Act." In fact, the Act says that if the respondent had a mistaken understanding about the issues, this is irrelevant in the issue of deciding incitement. Now, originally the case had been scheduled for a few days before the tribunal. In fact, it went on for several months, and a vast range of evidence was received on demographics, Islamic law, geopolitics, the Quran, the history of Islam. Meanwhile, on the side, some fascinating dynamics were being played out. A collection of Christians and Muslims gathered each day there in the courtroom to watch, to pray, I suppose, and to ponder what the outcome would be. Some more radically minded brothers and sisters from the Muslim side refused to stand for the judge's entrances because they didn't acknowledge the validity of Australian law. The imams of Melbourne, before the case started, made an offer to the judge that they could review the case for him after he had finished hearing all the evidence and advised him on what the correct finding would be. They themselves, they said, were accountable and answerable to the authority of Al-Azhar University in Cairo. At one point, Pastor Scott answered a question by quoting from the Quran, as he was wont to do, and the barrister for the Islamic Council, Debbie Mortimer, asked the judge to stop Scott from quoting from the Quran, as this was vilifying Muslims. Of course, this provided more ammunition for Scott, who responded that it was the Quran that was vilifying Muslims and not him. So we had some moments of comedy and high drama as well. In the end, Judge Higgins upheld the complaint. He found that the two pastors had incited hatred, contempt, revulsion and ridicule against Muslims. His judgments relied on findings about Islamic theology, which he made, including a report that he was confident in that the violent verses in the Quran had no applicability past the 8th century, so it was vilification of modern Muslims to say they were of any relevance today. The judge ruled that the two pastors had to cease from repeating such conduct anywhere in Australia. They were no longer allowed to express their views about Islam in public. They were also ordered to take out repeated prominent advertisements in Melbourne's daily newspapers reporting his findings against them, his conviction that they were unreliable witnesses, and this was an estimated cost of over $50,000. These advertisements would include acknowledgement of the judge's findings that they had broken the law. Now, the two pastors appealed the case to the Victorian Supreme Court. Their appeal was eventually upheld, with the case being referred back to the original tribunal for a new finding based on the same evidence. The first judgment was rejected on several grounds. Judge Higgins was said to have made more than a dozen errors of fact, imputing many statements to Daniel Scott which he in fact did not make. For example, perhaps the worst one was the judge alleged that Scott had called Muslims demons, whereas in fact what Scott had done was he discussed some verses in the Quran where actual demons, in Arabic the jinns, had converted to Islam. A key finding of the Supreme Court was that the judge had not adequately distinguished between hatred of ideas and hatred of people who hold those ideas, and the possibility of inciting the one without necessarily inciting the other. In this sense, the Supreme Court rejected a core contention which had been part of the Muslims' case from the very beginning, that one cannot make a distinction between Islam and Muslims. And this is, as I said, a theological contention. In the end, the case was settled out of court by the two parties whose energies had by then been exhausted. This was a long and expensive process. the legal fees of the pastors ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars. The Muslims were represented pro bono by one of Melbourne's leading law firms. The whole process from the initial complaint took about 4.5 years. Now, a great deal of public interest attended the case. Tens of thousands of signed petitions, tens of thousands of signatures on petitions opposing the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act were presented to Parliament. Significant federal politicians weighed into the debates. In the end, the government did make minor changes to the legislation, but what was more important was that all around Australia, other states stopped similar laws from proceeding. In fact, I believe this law had significance overseas, that it had a big impact on the attempted introduction of anti-religious vilification laws in the UK. Now, a principle which is widely accepted in Islam is that Muslims have the right to protection of their religious sentiments. Many Muslims believe that respect for Muhammad and Islam is a human right of Muslims. In Maududi's widely referenced framework of human rights in Islam, if you Google human rights in Islam, it'll come up. Clause 9 states, protection of religious sentiments. Along with the freedom of conviction and freedom of conscience, Islam has given the right to the individual that his religious sentiments will be given due respect, and nothing will be said or done which may encroach upon his right. So this complaint was not merely about legal process, it also reflected a theological requirement that negative presentations of Islam be actively opposed and countered, and that Muslims' religious rights, their human rights as defined on the theological basis of Islam itself, must be respected. This case, as I said, was influential and attracted a great deal of interest all around the world. I'd like to make some final comments about the larger process of Islamisation, of which this case was but one small symptom. Islamisation is the process of conforming the whole of a society's institutions and culture and knowledge base to Islamic requirements. Based on the example and the teaching of Muhammad, many Muslim theorists have regarded Islam as a system for the whole of life, one which shapes criminal law, ethics, the military, government, religious institutions. Islam does not traditionally recognise a distinction between religion and politics. In fact, Ibn Khaldun famously criticised medieval Christianity for separating religion and politics, claiming that it weakened Christianity greatly to make the distinction. Indeed, the traditional view is that all of society's institutions are intended to serve religious purposes. Now, in making such a sweeping generalisation as I've done, I'm very aware of dissenting views and the fact that Muslims hold a huge variety of highly nuanced positions on this issue. Nevertheless, the generalisation remains that Islam is a total system of life that seeks, in most of its manifestations, to impact and transform all areas of society. Now, in the West, we're observing the pressure to Islamisation on many fronts. These include requests to make adjustments to education, to sports, family law, food regulations and provision, foreign policy, multicultural policy, religious policy, the use of public space, finance, and also, of course, in the area of freedom of speech. Islamisation has both an intentional and deliberate, but also a hidden hand character. It is an intentional process because there are prominent and influential Islamic organisations which are very diligent in seeking to transform societies. One can point, for example, to the successes that have been made to provide guidance to American school textbook writers so that images of Islam and Muslims in school texts in the US are favourable, and certainly not negative. This falls into the category of Islamisation of knowledge, a very important aspect of the process. And undoubtedly in this area, the gains made on behalf of Islam have been planned and intentional. Another example of advances in the Islamisation of knowledge has been the great influence and leverage that's been won through financing from Islamic governments of Islamic studies centres in many universities in the West. Islamisation also has a hidden hand character. Islamic theology itself shapes Muslims and influences them to act in particular ways, which, however varied in the particularities of Muslims, taken together over a very large sweep of time and geography, can have consistent characteristics. One would be the insistence that it's not possible to make a distinction between Islam and Muslims when we're dealing with the so-called vilification issues. At the moment, we are seeing an international top-down and deliberate process underway to limit freedom of speech, specifically around criticism of Islam. This is being pursued at the highest levels through the United Nations as a planned top-down process. On the other hand, there's the grassroots pressure, the bottom-up factor, which was motivating the Islamic Council of Victoria. Now, the attempt to silence these two pastors on the subject of Islam is hardly unique or exceptional. Efforts are being made by many Muslims all over the world to a similar end. Some of these efforts are tragically illegal, offensive and misguided, such as the murder of Theo van Gogh. Other silencing efforts are made within the law, or even using the law, such as the United Kingdom's refusal to grant Geert Wilders a visa to the UK after pressure from Lord Ahmed and from other Muslims. There is a real issue, of course, about ensuring or doing what one can to ensure that Muslims are not victimised or discriminated against. I do not question that. But at the heart of the Victorian case, and many other incidents like it, is the deeper question about the extent of Sharia implementation. I believe that through this case and other incidents that have been important in shaping Australian public opinion in recent years, a degree of resistance is emerging in my nation to two key ideas which many Muslims accept, namely that Muslims have a right for their beliefs to be respected, and secondly that it's not possible to distinguish Islam from Muslims, that an attack on Islamic doctrines is personal. These beliefs, arising from theological considerations, are inconsistent with values of freedom of conscience and speech which have shaped Western civilization. Sadly, in some nations, resistance to Islamisation appears to be weak. In 2008, both the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, and Nicholas Phillips, Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, suggested that the United Kingdom could consider, in the words of Phillips, embracing Sharia law. Phillips argued, and I quote, that there is no reason why principles of Sharia law or any other religious code should not be the basis for mediation or other forms of alternative dispute resolution. And today in the UK, because of the laws that apply to resolving disputes, there are a large number of Sharia courts which have some legitimacy in British law. Archbishop Rowan Williams commented, "It's not as if we're bringing in an alien and rival system." Now, the case of the Islamic Council of Victoria versus Catch the Fire was enormously complex and convoluted. But at its heart, there was an issue about a principle of freedom of conscience and speech. That is, that one can have a strong aversion to another person's or group's beliefs without being convicted of hating the person. This is what Rushdie had to say after years of reflection, Salman Rushdie, on this difficult issue, speaking with approval of the values that he'd learnt as an undergraduate student in England. He said, "If an individual in a free society no longer has the right to say openly that he prefers one book to another, then that society no longer has the right to call itself free. Citizens have the right to complain about discrimination against themselves, but not about dissent from their thoughts. There cannot be fences erected around ideas, philosophies, attitudes, or beliefs." That was the crucial mistake of the Victorian Parliament in taking race incitement laws and turning them into religious incitement laws, because they entered in the area of making laws against incitement about beliefs. It was very complicated and difficult. And they forced a judge in a fairly low tribunal to have to make rulings on Islamic theology, because it became necessary to refer to theological issues in defending issues of good faith and reasonableness about statements relating to Islamic theology. It was a very bad mistake to introduce those laws. They're still unworkable, in my opinion. Whether the West adheres to its historic convictions will determine its future. A degree of alertness is required to the complex pressures being brought for societal transformations through the growing influence of Islam. My hope is that my own nation and this great one, the United States, will have the discernment to make wise choices in the face of these pressures, and far from sleepwalking into Sharia, that we will continue to earn and indeed to fight for the right to call ourselves free.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Mark, I think that gives us a lot of things to discuss. Maybe I could kick off with a first question. You commented a few times both for yourself, also for the discussions in the court and elsewhere about the two related distinctions. One is the distinction between criticizing a set of beliefs and criticizing the person that holds them. And the second one is the distinction between criticism on matters to do with race and criticism on matters to do with religion. That
Yes.
those are distinct phenomena. Two comments on that, just to note that in the push within the United Nations by the Organization of the Islamic Conference, they have in the last couple of years made a shift in strategy from trying to use the language of defamation of religion to trying to couch in more racial terms, because they hadn't got very far in the first one. That's just a comment. But the other thing is in terms of some things which have happened in Europe. We're doing a survey of, amongst other things, European laws concerning sort of defamation of religion and things of that kind. And in that context, some Muslims, particularly in this case in Britain, have emphasized that what the laws are seeking to protect is not what they are seeking to have protected. In this sense, the law is focusing, it says you can't attack people. You can attack beliefs and so on, but you can't attack people. And many Muslims have responded. It says, but that's not what we're complaining about. It says, you can attack me all you want. It doesn't matter if you attack me. If you attack Islam, it says that is what is offensive.
Yeah.
So the sort of the legal strategy, and at least for some Muslims, their concerns are running past each other.
Well, I think the defamation of religion line is actually very dangerous for the Islamic cause, because when a defamation case comes forward, the character of the person who's making the case is put on trial. That is, the truthfulness of the allegedly defamatory conduct becomes an issue for the court. Now, if the defamation of Islam goes to court, then you have a debate about what Islam does or does not teach. And then you have this public, Islam goes on trial, basically. The reputation of Islam goes on trial. So it's not really the right framework to use. I think it's inevitable that the alternative, the anti-incitement approach will be more and more emphasised. And I think you're right. What happened here, I think, is the thing that one of the things that really upset the respondents was they felt that Allah was insulted. That was part of their original complaint. And it was a salutary experience for them to realise how difficult it was to get their case through, and painful. I think even the court case itself was quite painful. At many times things were said about Islam, issues were brought forward, passages were cited and read from Islamic authorities that caused great distress to the Muslims who were present in the case. So I agree with you. There is a sense of frustration that the anti-incitement laws don't go the whole way, but they are still being used for this purpose. They will be used to try and silence criticism of Islam, even though that they're not ideal, but they're sort of the best thing that's available. The theological driver is to silence attacks on Islam. You use whatever resources you can, whatever legal or other resources are available to bring bring that about. And so I just acknowledge and accept what you say, that it's that in fact the Muslim community would be very glad if, in the UK, for example, if vilification of Islam itself or the Quran was made illegal.
Okay, thank you. Let's open it up to questions. Could I ask you, before you make your question or comment, just briefly give us your name and your affiliation, if relevant? Okay, thank you.
Thanks. My name is Bennett Graham. I work with the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, and we've been very active on the defamation issue at the UN for some time, and we're actually also international counsel in the Catch the Fire case in Australia. And so I obviously agree with a lot of the points you're making, and I think that you hit the nail on the head about the protecting ideas instead of the people who hold them. My question for you, though, to play a little bit of a devil's advocate, though, is there are legitimate cases around the world of discrimination against Muslims. And so my first question is how, as if you were a legislator or a policymaker, how would you address those concerns in a different way than the current mechanisms that the OIC and other countries or advocates for defamation or blasphemy laws, anti-vilification laws are using? And then my second part of the question is, how do you respond to the argument that this is a slippery slope towards creating an environment that becomes a tinderbox for violence, where yes, certain statements that are negative about beliefs should be permitted, but once those get pushed into the mainstream and everyone is accepting certain hateful ideas, then it just creates a tinderbox for violence. How would you react to both of those counter arguments?
Well, I accept the need for anti-discrimination legislation. The complexity with anti-discrimination legislation is all the exemptions that are needed. You know, the church wants to appoint a Christian secretary, for example, but you don't want people to discriminate on religious grounds in a milk bar or a bank. So working that out is quite complex. We're going through the process of debating that in Victoria at the moment. But I accept the need for anti-discrimination legislation. And I also do accept that Muslims experience hardship in many Western countries in different ways, for lots of different reasons. I think the tinderbox argument, to me, I think that feels like an intimidatory tactic, basically. If you don't give us what we want, there'll be a riot. And we want to be very, very careful about giving into those kinds of arguments. And because it feels like that there's a threat of violence. I mean, Lord Ahmed, as I recall, when he was speaking against Geert Wilders coming, sort of implied that there'd be riots in the streets. You know, that there'd be a lot of people out there angry and furious. The problem with running public policy on that basis is that you'll be hostage to the most violent and angry community that feels the strongest about its agenda. And you can't really produce this harmonious society and peaceful society on that basis. My suspicion would be that if a nation gives into that mentality, they will find that they will experience more slippery slope, because it becomes an appeasement outcome. If you appease that threat, the threat becomes more and more potent. I spent a meeting a few years ago with English church leaders speaking about possible strategies for educating Christians in the UK. And one of their responses was fear. And their fear was, if there's anything critical said about Islam, we will be attacked and it'll be our fault. So they were already, in fact, inculpating themselves, declaring their own guilt about potential violent acts that might be perpetrated against them for the possible criticism of Islam. Now, that mentality is the very mentality that the most violent and aggressive terrorists want people to have. That is, when we attack you, it will be your fault. And what we want is not only that you would suffer, but that you would feel guilty for what happens to you. And that's a bit like the battered wife syndrome. You know, it's you've been abusing me and it is my fault. So I'm very, very suspicious of that kind of argument. And I think if you accept it, you actually that's what the slippery slope looks like. If you want to know what the slippery slope looks like, look at the policy that English church leaders and political leaders are showing in the UK. They have adopted that line. They've bought into that hook, line and sinker, and they're going to reap the whirlwind if they keep going that way.
Okay.
Stuart Reuter, no particular affiliation today. It looks to me like you've just come up with the reason that perhaps the Islamic Council was willing to take on such a case, because who's going to be willing to take them on again? That even though they may have lost the case ultimately in 5 years, that you have effectively silenced anybody else who doesn't want to get on that slippery slope. And we see it here in this country with the Yale publishing that's going to take out the cartoons in a book talking about the effect of the cartoons. So, I mean, I think that is a very effective tactic to silence your adversary because of the fear of legal and other consequences.
Well, this is what
agree?
Well, this is what people call libel tourism. That is heavily funded. The potential for heavily funded cases coming out of, for example, Saudi Arabia, where books can be taken out of circulation as a threat of legal action. I actually don't think that was the case in Victoria. I think those Muslims acted with in the integrity of their convictions. They felt the behaviour was wrong, that it should be stopped, and they were trying to stop it. I don't think they really knew what they were biting off more than they could chew. In fact, the outcome of the case, yes, there has been a chilling effect. There's an element of that, but in general, the final outcome was regarded as by many as a vindication of the Christians. That is, no complaint was upheld. Daniel Scott is still running his seminars around Australia on Islam. He has not been silenced. I think one of the positive outcomes is that people understand the law a lot better. Personally, for example, I'm very, very clear on the kinds of activity that the law might fall foul of the law, and the kind of steps that need to be taken in order to avoid falling foul. So that clarity has been helpful. But you are right. It's very costly. These two pastors, and one of them, they could have lost their homes and everything they had if they had to pay the expenses of the Supreme Court appeal. They could easily have been bankrupted. They might have found themselves in conscience refusing to agree to the conditions and having to serve a sentence because they didn't have the resources or the will to pay the fine and submit to that. So, yeah, no, there is an element of that, but I think in this case it's been a bit different.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Cynthia. I'm a lawyer, and I'm very interested in the fusion of law, policy, and religion. Write a blog called Programs, Papers, and Softwares, and that sort of thing. And I'm curious. You mentioned truth as a defense, but you've not really touched upon opinion. And so I'm curious as to, under Australian law, is there an opinion defense? Could somebody say something couched in such a way as, this is how I interpret, in my opinion, these verses of the Quran, and in my opinion, this would lead to the other. And that would be, in our country, for example, the defamation law would be a complete defense to any sort of defamation or libel.
I'm not an expert in the law. I don't think that would be enough, as far as I understand, in defamation law. But if you are airing an opinion publicly in the public interest, say as a journalist, in good faith and reasonably, that would be an offence. That's accepted that you might be found to have incited those negative emotions, but the defence would be that it's in the public interest for people to express their opinions, and that you have a variety of opinions. And the sort of evidence that could be brought up in a court case is that this particular newspaper has published a variety of opinions on the issue, and that this is only one of a whole range. So that could be a defence in that public interest, or as part of a debate in the public interest. Yes. So yes, that would be covered. And I think mostly those laws have such an exemption of that kind. I don't think it's a defamation defence, but it's certainly a defence for the incitement.
Okay.
Faith McDonald from the Institute on Religion and Democracy. I direct the Religious Liberty Program, so I was also aware of the case in Australia. And you mentioned Rowan Williams and his ideas on Sharia in the UK. I'm wondering more about what the church leaders in Australia did on this case. Were there people on both sides, and how did that boil down, and what are they doing today?
Some parts of the church supported the Muslims. In fact, two of the expert witnesses on behalf of the Islamic Council were priests, an Anglican priest and a Catholic priest. Also, representatives of the Catholic Church and the Uniting Church made submissions to the tribunal in favour of the Islamic Council. And immediately after Judge Higgins made his ruling, there was a coalition of religious leaders, including some Christian leaders, who came out to support the Islamic Council and criticise the two pastors. I think, however, most Christians were very concerned about what was happening to the pastors, and there was a huge amount of support for them. The Australian situation is different from the UK. One of the influences is Cardinal George Pell, the head of the Australian Catholic Church. He has been a strong critic of Islam at different times, has written a number of papers. So you have, as it were, a top-down, sophisticated position. And I would say there's nowhere near the same capitulation, you might say, amongst Anglican bishops that you'd see in the UK. And a lot of key agencies, missionary agencies and others, have shown more, I say, resistance, or at least a willingness to listen, to give time to evaluate the issues. Initially, yes, there were a group of leaders who, almost as a knee-jerk, wanted to be seen to be opposing vilification, opposing disruption to multicultural harmony, wanted to be in favour of us all getting on well together, that sort of response. So I think there's been a diversity of responses. What I've observed over recent years is a lot of people have been sitting in the middle wondering what to think. And gradually many of them, their questions about Islam are becoming clearer, and their answers are causing them more concern. So that there's a gradual awakening and an ability to have a public discussion. You see it in the newspapers as well, that journalists are more willing to talk about these issues. And there's a wide range of views expressed in debate in Australian newspapers about issues to do with Sharia and Islam. You'll often see when Islamic terrorists are arrested that there is no embarrassment about saying that these are Muslims or that they were supported by a fatwa. So that sort of censoring that's happening is less. There has been recently a project sponsored by the Australian Attorney General to take out Islamic terminology in referring to terrorism, to have a kind of a special lexicon that has religion taken out of it. So, I think Walid Fares criticised that a few weeks back, but that's been a little bit exceptional. In general, there's more robustness in Australia around these issues.
Okay.
William Murray, Religious Freedom Coalition.
Bill, wait for the mic. We are taping this, and it will be on our website.
Yeah, I should apologize. As chair, I usually like to go to different parts of the room in succession, but it's giving Beth too much of a work. You look like Roger Federer last night.
William Murray, Religious Freedom Coalition. You mentioned two things: the slippery slope and support of certain kinds of discrimination laws yourself. Don't you feel that originally all discrimination laws were related to government? That government could not discriminate, that government institutions could not censor, that government institutions could not boycott. That the problem began when those laws that were intended for government became applicable to individuals, where you tell the individual, you cannot censor, you cannot boycott, you cannot prefer your own societal group to another societal group, because then you place government what their preferences were. I have a right as a publisher, to censor, but the government does not have a right to censor. Is somebody going to come along and say, okay, you have to censor your material. We don't like it. So I think the slippery slope actually begins by trying to apply strict rules of governance, that a government should not discriminate, that a government should not interfere in the rights of others, and trying to apply that to individuals, so that the Sunday school teacher is forced to rent her extra room in her house to a pair of practicing homosexuals.
Yeah.
Where does the interference stop in the private life if we take what was originally intended, and a good idea when it was originally intended at government institution, and attempt to apply it to individuals?
I think that's more a statement than a question, but a very brief response. It is interesting, in Australia there are lots of exemptions, and one of them would be someone who rents out their own home. If you rent it out to fewer than 5 people or something, you can discriminate as much as you like. It's those exemptions that are under pressure at the moment. But I think, to put the other side, if you're experiencing severe economic disadvantage and discrimination in everyday life, then if large corporations won't employ you or will disadvantage you in the workplace, it's quite crippling for people. So I think that it's not just about big government or government institutions. It's also about the freedom of people to participate in everyday life economically. But then you do have this need for, like a publisher is a good example, or someone running a B&B, or someone who wants to employ a personal carer in their home. And the question is how all those exemptions are tuned to those various needs. It's very difficult and hard fought. We're going through all these reviews at present in Australia, and it's not quite clear what the outcome of that will be. Very interestingly, the submission that was made by the Islamic Council of Victoria in the recent review of these issues in Victoria argued that those people that are employed in Sharia finance departments of banks banks should be allowed to discriminate in favour of appointing Muslims in their Sharia finance sections, or in food preparation if there's halal food issues. So, these are issues that Muslims are very concerned about as well, to see how these exemptions will be applying. Yeah.
Okay. My question, you may have already answered it, but was to...
And please identify yourself.
Oh, right. David Johnson, Drell Solutions. Trying to represent industry and business and engineering. Incitement as advocacy as opposed to defamation. Things like Coca-Cola and various financial mechanisms. Doesn't that lead to, if you have a counter-marketing campaign, is that un-Islamic, and will that end up in a defamation situation?
Can you explain a little bit more what you mean by a counter-marketing campaign?
Counter-marketing campaign would be something like Coca-Cola versus Coca-Cola.
Yes.
If we incite advocacy for everyday products that are Muslim products, or for one group of religious preferences, is any counter to that? Will that become de facto defamation of a Muslim product?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, potentially people can take offence at many things, and want to get some leverage on it. Yeah. It's an interesting question. What if someone said, I refuse to eat Hershey's chocolate bars if they have a halal sign on them, and they make a campaign against eating halal foods, what are the boundaries of their freedom of speech in talking about that issue, about them being compelled to eat food that's ritually slaughtered or something? How do you work those issues out? There are lots of unknowns, many unknowns about how people will interpret the expression of religious convictions or resistance to religious convictions.
Isn't that what got Bridget Bardot in trouble?
Yes.
You want to talk about that?
I'm not as yes, she was really convicted, wasn't she? Of,
Yes.
Repeatedly of inciting hatred. I mean, a lot has to do with how it's expressed. If you actually stigmatise a category of people, like these people are X, and use words of contempt or ridicule or mockery, you're going to get into deep trouble. But what's very problematic if someone says, I have absolute contempt for, the belief that Jesus is the Son of God or whatever, and I think that's a despicable view, when that gets turned into a incitement of hatred against Christians, if that's how it's interpreted, then that's a big jump, and it's preserving that distinction that's really important. Yeah.
Just a note on that, don't of course forget the advertising for Turco-Cola. If you've never seen those ads, most of them have Chevy Chase in them. They're very funny. Just mention that.
Yeah, we haven't had those in Australia. So.
Okay.
Kit Bigelow with the Baha'is in the U.S.
Yes.
I have a question whether or not this law has been used at all for anti-Semitic actions or accusations. Is there neo-Nazi type of activity in Australia? And if there has been, is there a discussion about similarities or differences between anti-Semitic behavior and anti-Islamic behavior?
That's a complex issue. There is a background, I suppose, of extreme anti-Jewish views. It's been there in Australia for a long time. And as in many countries, if you visit a Jewish school or a synagogue, you'll find there's a guard outside in Australia. My parish is in the most Jewish, 70% of my immediate neighbours are Jews, so I'm very, very aware of that. In fact, I believe it was the Jewish community that were the principal advocate for this law. And they have, I don't know of any case where they've actually taken it to VCAT, where they've actually used it. My impression of the Jewish community is that if an issue arises, they would prefer to deal with it behind the scenes or else have the state prosecute. They prefer not to get involved in public stoushes with other groups unless they're very, very, very careful about who they focus on. And so they generally use a kind of a different series of approaches. But yes, they supported the law. I think the weaknesses in the law were not apparent to them because for Jewish people the distinction between race and religion is not very clear. And their view would have been that that attacking Jewishness or Jewish beliefs is the thin end of the wedge of anti-Semitism, that the attacks on Jews actually begins by a derogation and attacks on their religion. So they were very strongly supportive of the law for that reason. But they hadn't thought through how this would play out with the full range of religious groups. Let me give you an example. There was a convicted pedophile witch in a state prison in Victoria who took a complaint out against the Salvation Army in Victoria for running an alpha course in the prison, because in the alpha course Nicky Gumbel spoke about the burning in the Acts of the Apostles of all of the ritual spell books and so on, and he speaks in a way criticising witchcraft in the alpha course. So this man took out a complaint at the tribunal saying that the Salvation Army had vilified witchcraft by speaking of burning witchcraft objects. So I would have, in a way, because he was such an appalling example, who had ritually kind of been involved in ritual prostitution, he's such an appalling individual, he was dealt with fairly summarily by the court. But his principle is a very interesting one. That is, what would happen to, what would a Satanist make of Christians' tendencies to regard Satan as evil and to incite contempt for Satan if he was your object of worship? Shouldn't this law protect your identity and protect you from being vilified by those that think Satan is bad? Now, I don't think the people that introduced that law had any concept of the complexity and the conflicted nature of religions, where one person's evil is another person's good. And that had never been thought through. It is a symptom, in my view, of the ignorance that exists in the secular West in general about religions and the way in which they function, and the completely conflicting understandings they have of good and evil and so on. Just another point about that is, a sad thing in a way about this case is that it incited a lot of tensions in the community. The law was supposed to bring harmony, but instead it raised the temperature of anxiety and conflict. So I'd say in that sense it was a failure. From the point of view of the Christians' case, it was a success, I think, because in the end, the Supreme Court upheld these principles that I've outlined, that there's a difference between criticising an individual and criticising their faith.
Michael Horowitz at Hudson Institute. Just a quick follow-up on Kit's question. When this case first began to develop, I contacted leaders of the Jewish community in Australia, and you would describe their initial support of the bill. I wondered if that shifted in any kind of way as the process moved forward. Where was the Jewish community, not at the beginning, but where are they now?
I think many of them became sympathetic to the two pastors, and there were some attempts to support them. One of the two pastors had visited one of those right-wing groups and spoken to them, so he lost support at that point, because when they became aware of that connection. There is quite a group of Jewish people in Australia who are increasingly concerned about Islamisation and Sharia issues. So there's been the case has been part of the tapestry of issues and events that have led to an awakening, I suppose, of the Jewish community about these issues. There's been a sense of embarrassment about it, I think, amongst some. Officially, you might say this law is part of the fundamental partnership between the government and the Jewish community. So if a member of the government speaks to the Jewish community, they'll often name this law as an example of how positively the government is working with the Jewish community. But behind the scenes, there's a lot of doubt and uncertainty about how it's playing out. And we're still going through the process of thinking that through. There was a case where the Jewish community did seek to implement a process against radical Islamic anti-Semitism using the law, but it didn't get to VCAT. I think there was some sort of intervention, or it was resolved in a different way.
There's more questions coming, but if I could just pick up on this theme. Two things. One is a lot of the parallels with Canada are fascinating. And what is dealt with under Canadian human rights tribunals, the actual legislation is different, but the human rights tribunals in Canada first began to get in the area of trying to regulate speech as an attempt to go after right-wing groups, specifically neo-Nazis. And these were not just right-wing, they were neo-Nazis. So there's a lot of support from the Jewish community for that.
Yes.
But again, now having second thoughts about it, and one reason seems to be these laws don't seem to be extremely effective in shutting anybody up. They're very good at publicizing them. One of these guys in Canada, one of the Nazis, Ernst Zundel, his office was right across the road from the one I was in. And the sort of locals knew about him. Now he's quite famous because of all the publicity when people tried to shut him up. And I don't think he's been effectively shut up. With the internet, you can't. But anyway, that's just an aside.
Same thing. Same
Yep.
thing. These two pastors became famous because of this complaint.
Yeah.
They became heroes,
Yeah.
And that was a strategic error, I think, on the part of the Islamic Council.
Another sort of slightly larger question coming up in relation to this. One of the themes internationally and in European discussions, in the UN, when member states of the European Union have opposed attempts to have a regime of anti-defamation of religion, the European Union members generally at the UN have consistently opposed that, so that they've done well. But one of the things which has been brought back to them in the UN and also domestically is saying you have laws outlawing Holocaust denial. And now you can add, you also in the case of France, maybe elsewhere, you have laws outlawing denial of Armenian genocide. So in other cases, there are certain things concerning other religious groups which you're not allowed to say. why can't,
Yes.
why not the case of Muslims? Has this come up in Australia too?
Well, exactly. In the anti-racial discrimination laws in Australia, Sikhs and Jews have both managed to get themselves declared as races for the purposes of the anti-racial discrimination laws. And the Muslims say that discriminates against us because we should be as protected as Jews are or as Sikhs are. So that's created part of the pressure for review of these cases. So those sorts of how do you have consistency in applying to different groups has come up.
Okay.
My name is Patrick Poole with Pajamas Media. I know you made some observations about the Islamic scholars' letter to the Pope.
Yes.
Namely that their claims that Islam supported freedom of speech, and yet many of those same individuals supported capital punishment for Muslim apostates. You've mentioned here the Islamification of knowledge. Is this attempt by Islamic scholars to take Western terminology such as freedom of speech and using it in those contexts when they're clearly advocating something different, is this an attempt to fundamentally rewrite these concepts and doctrines?
Ultimately, the answer would be yes, if you have the radical perspective. You want to restructure the ethical, moral, the values to make them more Sharia compliant. I think with regard to each particular strategy, it's very pragmatic. If you can get leverage, any leverage, you'll use it. If Westerners will accept freedom of speech as a value, then you try and apply it and use it. I mean, whatever it is. So multiculturalism is obviously popular as a strategy. Let's see how we can use that as a strategy. So I think it's very pragmatic that you use what resource you can, make use of whatever is available. The internet's there. Let's use that. It's pragmatic. I think the end view doesn't necessarily could look quite different. So it's about finding a pathway to a desired result. One of the problems I think in evaluating these kinds of phenomena is to try and understand what the end view is, and that's difficult because it's not always immediately clear. You have to think quite deeply and try and understand the whole framework, the worldview, the ideal society that's being promoted behind these strategies.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Tazeen Ahmed. I'm here representing the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. I had a couple of different points. One, you talked about how separating Islam, the religion, and the individual. I think a lot of times, though, when a Muslim does something, okay, whether it's whoever it is, it's all of a sudden attributed to Islam. He's an Islamic. All of a sudden, he becomes a representative. When you had Timothy McVeigh, do whatever terrorist act he did, it was not attributed to his religion. It was not attributed as this is something from Christianity. He was an individual. He was a disturbed individual, as were the people, I believe, that do terrorist acts. Our community is worldwide. We all constantly, it is the message that we've been given to people is one of peace, one of nonviolence. When Salman Rushdie, as you stated earlier, did write the book and there was all these fatwas, our community did give an interview, the leader of our community was in London at the time, did give an interview to the press, saying that, this is not what Islam stood for. And not that what Salman Rushdie did, he did that as an individual, but the violence, that we should not respond in a violent way. We should write our response if we feel that that's the way. But I think that the sensationalism prevented them from showing that side of the argument, and I think it a lot of times prevents those moderate opinions from being shown, whereas you pick certain people who are more, sort of in your face and very radical, and sometimes some of these people they quote are completely illiterate and uneducated and don't even know what Islam stands for, but they are quoted as, because they've got a beard and they're wearing a turban, they're representatives of the religion. That was just one point. I just felt like those are things that do happen.
Yeah.
Islam. I don't think, and once again, it's individuals then are taking we're taking individual opinions and attributing it to Islam, whereas, I think that the religion has its place of its own, and individual opinions may not always be in line with it. They may pick and choose verses from the Quran that support their point of views to promote their political agenda or their personal agenda or their financial agenda. The other just the point that I wanted to address was you talked about Islamization.
Yes, Islamization.
Of the culture here, or the country here. I think that us trying to educate people here about what Islam really is, I don't see that as being a threat. I see that as, things happen in history, and, a lot of times you don't hear about it at the time. You'll find out it's later, and because people have made an effort to get all the facts out, you can see both sides of the story. So if Muslims living in this country, I've grown up here, my kids have grown up here, they've gone to high school, to college, if we are trying to let people know or educate people what Islam is to us and what we believe Islam is, I don't see how that can be a threat to the West or so.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. Education is good, I believe, and stereotyping is bad. People are very complex and varied. I suppose if I was going to give one point of resistance to what you said, it would be certainly there are uneducated radicals, but some of the radicals are highly sophisticated people, and some of the statements from some of the supreme, most respected Islamic scholars and leaders in the world are really very disturbing. So you don't have to find what we would regard as a fanatic to see some very really serious views being expressed in the world today. And some radical theologians, like I suppose Durie is an example. He was not a fool. He was a highly intelligent person. I profoundly disagree with his perspectives, but I acknowledge his intellect. And so I think it's really helpful when you're dealing with religious beliefs and the complexity of them to have respect for the other side, to listen carefully, to realise that your stereotype might be unreasonably positive, or it might be unreasonably negative. But you need to take the time to listen carefully and understand accurately what's being said, and not just approach it from a position of prejudice or presupposition about the other's opinion.
Mark, could you just, in light of that question, just clarify the difference between knowledge of Islam and Islamization of knowledge, which was your term? What you mean by that term, Islamization of knowledge? Because I think that there may be some confusion about what you mean by that. That's not the same as knowledge of Islam, which
thank
I think
you.
is what you were addressing.
Yeah, thank you. Islamization of knowledge, I suppose, would be to seek to promote only one view about certain important historical processes or religious processes, to present that as the only view or the correct view, and to shut out alternative views. I think there are lots of aspects of history that are not well understood, and there's a tendency to present those aspects in a very one-sided view. A good example, I suppose, is the history of the jihad, the conquest of non-Muslim societies, the treatment of non-Muslims under Islamic law. That's the subject of the book about which the flyer was distributed. I think that's an area which is very poorly understood, and there's a tendency to promote really mythological views about the past. One of the common myths is the idea of these golden ages. I'd say that's the promotion of this idea of a sort of Andalusian golden age where Islam coexisted with other groups in beautiful harmony. I would see that as an example of the Islamization of knowledge. Now, if you were a true believer in that view, you might say, no, that's just teaching people about Islam and informing them. So it does depend on your worldview whether you regard dissemination of a certain piece of information as just sharing knowledge that you have, or whether you regard it as in fact an Islamization of the knowledge. So these are quite easily disputed areas. But I think in the UK the tendency that we've seen comment on the media a few times to suppress the discussion about the Holocaust in in schools. It's been brought to attention a few times. These sorts of pressures to change historical awareness or influence historical consciousness in a particular direction. The example I've given is a fundamental issue about the distinction between challenging an idea and criticising an individual. The erasure of that distinction is, again, as a kind of Islamization of values or of ethics, to say that you can't make a distinction between Islam itself and Muslims.
You may have partially answered this earlier, but I wanted to get at your comments about what motivates, what's the mindset behind the kind of Christians that you mentioned who are so quick to go to bat for the defenders of Sharia. You mentioned part of it was unintended consequences coming from ignorance of religion. I'm thinking of the Catholics and the Anglicans who would never for a moment think of initiating a lawsuit or go to the defense of somebody who would criticize, say, the new atheists, the Christopher Hitchens and the sort. In other words, it would be first to rush to the defense of somebody like Hitchens, Dawkins, even as they are very harshly criticized Christians, and yet, the same people that would rush to the defense of the new atheists are also seem to be the ones that would want to rush to apologize for the kind of things you described in Australia. And I just think that's perplexing because it's so evidently contradictory. And I try to get into the mindset of somebody that would follow that course, and I have a hard time figuring it out. So can you help us out here?
Well, I think there is at base one problem is ignorance. I think if they've never really studied Islam or Muhammad carefully, thoroughly, they might approach this whole issue without a proper understanding of some of the issues. They would look at the long series of complaints against Daniel Scott and be unable to tell which of those statements were actual quotes from the Quran and which weren't. They just wouldn't have a clue whether he was just making these things up or not. So they're just quite unable to assess it. Certainly, there's also a desire to promote harmony and tolerance in the community. They don't want extremists to drive a society. They don't want people that have come from other countries importing their own prejudices and religious bigotries and conflicts, so they're trying to speak out in that area. There's also sometimes anxiety that there's a kind of rising sentiment against Muslims, so they feel there's a social justice issue of speaking up in favour of the people that are vulnerable and could be oppressed. Another factor which I think is very important is a long-term cultivation of relationships. I'm sure the Archbishop of Canterbury has been involved over quite a long period of time in dialogue with Muslim counterparts who have Islamised his knowledge about Islam. That is, they've conveyed information to him which has presented a particular understanding of Sharia. They would have emphasised the Abrahamic character of Islam, that it was based on the worship of the same God, that Sharia wasn't an alien system but it shares the same basic fundamental foundations, for example, as the law of Moses and the Torah. So having been subjected to that dialogue over a long period of time, that's how he comes out. It's sort of the Christian thing to do. And so there's a worldview of kind of gentleness and passiveness. I think it's related to the fact that Christians are pretty silent by and large on the persecuted church issues. That they're sometimes people from Jewish or other backgrounds are quite shocked at how passive Christians are. People will be hearing a lot more from Falun Gong about persecution than from the churches about persecution of Christians in China. Maybe some of the other persecuted minorities would wish that Christians were more active on behalf of their own, because their own causes, the Sabaeans and the Baha'is and others, might get more support from the Christian community if the Christians even cared about their own. So there's a whole range of I think, failures, really, in the Christians' view of the world that make them vulnerable and really not resistant in some of these areas.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, Emily Bell's World Magazine. I know you're speaking from the Australian perspective, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on the hate crimes laws that are in
I haven't been following the development of those enough. I noticed that President Obama, when he spoke in Cairo, said that he thought his responsibility as President of the United States to fight against negative stereotypes of Islam wherever they appear. And I wonder whether that personal agenda that he's taken on is related to those laws. I'm not certain. I'm reluctant to delve into an area where I don't understand. But in general, as I was trying to understand these issues, I thought that the International Covenant of the Protection of Civil and Political Rights gives fairly good guidelines. That is, it focuses on discrimination, incitement of discrimination, incitement of violence. It's quite a high bar, but they are the core things. And if nations, in introducing anti-incitement laws, focus on the ICCPR, they will set a good example for the rest of the world and allow a considerable amount of freedom. But in Australia, we went much further into the incitement of ridicule and strong feelings and emotions, which are very, very difficult. So I would say I don't know what's happening in Congress, so I apologise for that. But if they're sticking to that standard, they'll do a lot better than if they produce something quite vague and allowing a lot of confusion that the courts will have to then sort out later on.
Can I inject something here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to inject something quickly. We were talking earlier about the slippery slope and the Lord Ahmed threat, veiled threat, if you will, in the UK. There was one of the big arenas where these issues are being debated and fought over is the UN, of course. And the King of Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah, came to the UN last spring and said that the way to world peace and harmony would be assured if these anti-defamation laws were adopted. So it was sort of the same kind of threat in the background, with his country being one of the largest producers of, I guess, jihadists. The U.S. yesterday took its seat in the Human Rights Council of the UN, and I thought it was interesting that one of the issues that it highlighted was free speech. And the Assistant Secretary for International Organizations of the State Department, taking the U.S. seat, gave a speech, an opening speech, and in her remarks she said, "The U.S. believes that the governments have a responsibility to condemn hateful speech and to promote respect and tolerance. We also believe fundamentally that the best way to fight intolerance and hate is through open and free debate and discussion of ideas. In such an open environment, hateful and racist remarks are held up to bright light of public scrutiny and seen for the scourge they are." So actually I thought that was hopeful. I mean, it was maybe an indirect response to this fight that's going on by the OIC in the UN, but it seemed to be saying that while the United States itself would condemn hateful speech, it was going to basically, by, I guess, moral opprobrium of the community, try to deal with it rather than through anything more direct.
I think that's a great emphasis, and that is very hopeful. Just was reminded of a report that was done some years ago in France, which looked at the problems of issues in classrooms in the schools. So in some areas, young Muslim students have opposed studying certain French authors because they regarded them as anti-Islamic. And there have been many other issues in French schools. And what they found was that it's a slippery, that's an example of the Islamisation of knowledge, where certain perspectives are taken out of the curriculum because it will just cause too many problems to study them. Now, it was found, I think, that in the schools which had basically stood up to this pressure and insisted on teaching of the traditional curriculum, of maintaining a secular approach in the schools, the level of troubling incidents, intimidation, was much less. But the schools that had sort of bent over backwards to try to accommodate, to give ground, they ended up having more problems with aggressive harassment of teachers and more serious issues of conflict. That was a very interesting study that showed that, you know, giving concessions is not necessarily going to create, you don't necessarily reach the point where suddenly it's all right and there'll be peace. There can be more and more pressure to keep giving more and more ground away.
Sorry, I just wanted to follow up, and I had a couple comments about the discussion of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial laws, where this has definitely been an argument that I've come across consistently at the UN, is Pakistan and Egypt and other OIC countries raise the issue of the existence of Holocaust denial laws or anti-Semitism laws or things like anti-Sikh laws that exist on the books, mostly in Europe, but also in places like Australia. And one of the things that I think is important to distinguish is coming back to this discussion of the conflation of race and religion and mutable and immutable characteristics, where religion remains a mutable characteristic. Now, that doesn't mean we want to be defending flippant religions of steak and whiskey at the local prison, but sincere religious belief is something that we do want to uphold, and you do have the capability of changing that. Now, I think one of the things that may be important as we look at anti-Semitism laws in particular, and my theology on the lineage of Sikhism is fuzzy as far as how Sikhs trace their heritage, but I know that in Judaism, one becomes a Jew through your parents and through bloodlines, and that there is actually a race of Jews. And part of the problem in this debate comes down to what is a Jew? Is a Jew a nationality, a language, a religion, a race, etc., an ethnicity? But I think that if we see anti-Semitism laws as race laws, it does clarify things. When it comes to Holocaust denial laws, these are things that in the U.S. they would never stand up with First Amendment jurisprudence. And hopefully there will be one day in Europe when there is no need for Holocaust denial laws.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that there's also a problem of conflation of religion and history, where the Holocaust is something that we all know happened. I recall a story that I heard recently of a gentleman in the Middle East, in Palestine, who claimed that 9/11 was a hoax and had been performed by Jews or the Bush administration or something to that effect. But when he finally came over to the U.S., went to Ground Zero, saw what had happened, he's never denied what happened on 9/11 since. And so I think if we stand our ground and say the Holocaust is a fact, it happened, but that doesn't change the debate when it comes to the free expression of religious ideas and the conflicting truth claims that will come about, where inevitably the Holocaust brings up a lot of tense things, but I think that it needs to be distinguished away from religious discussion.
Okay, Michael again.
Can I first thank you? I've sat in more conferences and sessions than I even care to think about, and your civility, your balance is just quite extraordinary in the sophistication of your comments, and I'm very, very grateful for it.
Well, you're very kind.
This is Michael. There'll be a butt coming.
I want to. No, there is no. I want to ask you to elaborate on the point you made about Christian leaders.
Yes.
My experience is that Christian leaders who see Christianity as a form of ethical behavior
Yes.
are the ones who are most apologetic and most fearful of speaking out against, and most inclined to appease, and most fearful of being criticized. Whereas Christians who are Christ-centered and who see their religion as a source of miracles and faith stand up for their own views, civilly, often, as you have, and
Yes.
effectively as you have. And so isn't this a question, really, of Christians having a greater sense of their own virtue and value, historically and in the present? And isn't much of the problem a problem of Christianity losing its own belief in itself?
I think that's absolutely right. Michael, did you write some years ago an article criticising Christians for not being active enough? And yeah, thank you. I want to express my appreciation in return to you for that. It's a great article. I think that's true. And you might say that the Christian who just believes in the Golden Rule and the Ten Commandments and that's it, is quite likely to think that all religions more or less have the same values, and they're fairly limited but core. And they sort of also assume that they're self-evident values, that all religions will have the same values because, after all, everyone knows that you should love your neighbour as yourself. And they're often very ill-informed about the history of their faith, the price that's been paid to fight for it. In our tradition, freedom of religion is not really valued. We have no tradition of fighting for it. In fact, Australia's been influenced by the negative effects of sectarianism, the conflicts of the English and the Irish in our history. We're kind of frightened of religion. So I agree with you. The challenge is for Christians to educate themselves about their own faith. I wrote a little book called Revelation, subtitled Do We Worship the Same God?, in which I look at these questions of what does it mean to believe in Jesus and to believe the things about God that the Bible says. How does that differ from the Quran and the Islamic Isa? I want to equip Christians to have some understanding of their foundations. It's absolutely true. One of the biggest challenges for the church in the West is just to educate, to catechize its own constituents. And we've drifted into a situation where many people not call themselves Christians nominally, but don't have they wouldn't die for their convictions. They wouldn't die for their creeds. They wouldn't regard the belief that Jesus is coming again as something that's all that significant, really. It's just something you say. And so we will pay for that. And I think I've read some quite poignant pleas from secularist atheists in Europe asking, why isn't the church more active? Where are the Christians when we need them? But, they've kind of gone into hiding, settled down, gone quiet, and that's really a great problem. To give you one example, I believe one of the reasons why we allow this distinction between belief and identity is the teaching of Jesus that you should love your enemy. And the concept of that someone who would have enmity towards you is someone that you can love makes a distinction between your fundamental disagreement with whatever principles they hold and yet your commitment to love and appreciate them as people. Now, that very simple ethical statement of just a few words has had, I think, a profound effect on our legal and political value system, and one of the effects of that is that we make that distinction between belief and identity. Now, Christians have lost that memory. We've lost that ability. I was sitting in on a debate in Australia about the killing of Aboriginal people, and one of the speakers made the point that in the 19th century in Australia, most leaders in the Australian in government administration were either evangelical Christians or they were humanists, and either way they believed in the equality of all people. It was a true historical statement. But the audience burst out laughing because they had no historical awareness. They'd forgotten about the huge effort of evangelical Christians in the 19th century fighting against slavery. They'd forgotten about the shaping influence that their faith had had on their society. And in a sense, then, their values are up for grabs for anyone that will speak into them. If someone says to them, look, our faith is the same as yours, and Sharia law is the same as what you believe, they will say, oh, why not? Because they don't even know what their heritage is and where they've come from. And that ignorance is, I think, kind of suicidal, really. And as a pastor, I'm deeply concerned. One of the reasons why I speak about these issues is for me it's a pastoral calling to help awaken the church, equip the church, help people to understand where they've come from and where they're heading if they're awake. Mm.
Okay, we've got three more in 2 minutes, so let's make it very quickly. Yep.
Very quickly. I appreciate what you just said about the assumptions that we make that all others have. The
Microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry. The assumption that all others. Several years ago, I was with an Israeli chief of staff and the head of their military, and he said, "You know, we'll lose." He said, "You'll lose." And there were about 10 of us in the room. We were absolutely shocked. And then he said to us, the reason is we look at our enemies in the mirror. And as long as we see the enemies as ourselves, as long as we think that their reasons for fighting us are the reasons that we would fight, if the beliefs they hold are the same type of beliefs that we do,
Quickly.
we cannot win.
Thank you. Okay.
Quick one. Do you see any similarities between institutionalized religion and its effects on populations and governance and those bans on similarities in behavior with governors?
With Islam,
Yes, institutionalized religion, Islam Sharia, in, trying to push itself for the kind of behavior that would ban religions.
I think it's fundamentally different. In Islamic law, non-Muslims have a permission to exist under Islam and keep their faith. Certain types of religions, provided they accept certain conditions. The communist view was different. That is, that religion itself, in all its forms, should be opposed and gradually eradicated through discouragement, persecution, and discrimination. So there are some similarities in strategies and effects, but the fundamental outlook is and the approach is very different. For example, in the Islamic tradition, I've looked through hundreds of commentaries. Non-Muslims are allowed to keep their faith, but they must adopt an attitude of inferiority and gratitude. So that's very different from the communist view, which is to say, your beliefs are pernicious. If you teach your children, we'll take the children away. It's a very, very different worldview. I mean, in my view, I think Islam will be more resilient than communism. I mean, it's a much more serious and long-term challenge to engage with Islam's particular take on other religions than the communist one.
Okay, there we must stop. Thank you, Mark, for your comments, and thank you all for coming and for your comments also.